My name is George Arola. My wife Karen and I moved to Oak Hammock 8 years ago. I titled my talk Living History because 200 to 300 years from now, when historians are writing about the events of the day, we're living through those events. And not just living through them, but in some cases contributing to developments, hopefully advances. And so we're living in times that are going to be written about a few years from now. I'm also using the term recalled because I read a couple of books recently on the brain and memories and how they're formed. Our memories ain't what they used to be. In some cases, they've even changed somewhat from what actually happened. My older brother, older sister, and I were born in this house. I was born in 1940. And my parents were married in 1936, and this is the first home they bought. A couple years later, I was told we moved to this house. I do remember living here, lived here until September of 1952. Note the stone or the snow roadside piled up on the side of the house. That's to try to keep the basement a little bit warmer. When we talk about technology, we seem to think in terms of what we see and what we're using here today, and our iPhones and computers and smart tablets and smart homes and all that. But there's a little bit beyond that. I can remember when electricity was installed in this house. It was a big deal for a farm kid to watch those machines dig those big holes. Seems like they were 3 foot across. Of course they weren't. And erecting those poles. And that first Christmas, I remember my older brother, older sister, and myself pooled our money and bought our mother a lamp for Christmas to hang on the parlor wall. Never did have indoor plumbing. Had an outhouse that was out behind the house, kind of behind that chicken coop you can see in the background. And I remember we kept a broom in there in the wintertime to sweep the snow off the seat. Did not make for a particularly pleasant experience, except in the wintertime. Everything's frozen, so at least there wasn't any smell associated with it. And I remember our heating. We had a wood stove for cooking in the kitchen. We had a wood furnace in the living parlor room area, and that was it. No circulating air. We had grates in the floor where the heat could rise from the ceiling up into the rooms above, into the bedrooms. And you'd wake up in the morning on a winter morning and there would be ice formed on the inside of the windows. You learn to get out of bed in a hurry and get dressed. Another technology change. I don't remember us having horses, so I was told that when we moved from that first home to our second home, we got rid of the horses and got our first tractor. I do remember this dump rake, and we had one just like that my father and the older brother would use to rake the hay into windrows for subsequently putting in the barn, and we'll see that a little later. Technology changed, jumped to a side delivery rake. That was a big advance because now you could keep your rows straighter, neater, more completer. And this was the hay loader. Ours was red, but other than that, it looked about exactly like that. Our hay wagon was the same, except we had rubber tires instead of metal tires on the hay rack. And there we are. That is a family photo a few years back. I had a bunch of family photos dumped on me. Maybe I should say bequeathed to me. And this is one of them. Those are my 2 younger sisters. By that time, they were both born in that house that we saw earlier. And that's my dad on the hay wagon, my sister up on the hay wagon in the background, and that's me with a black hat on the front corner of the hay wagon. And one of my sisters says that that's our mama's butt that you see there. This is a picture, not one from our farm, of what the sling looks like when it goes up in there. And when we were loading the hay onto the hay rack in the field, they would lay 3 ropes down on the bottom, put some hay on top of that, another 3 ropes in the middle, put hay on top of that, and then a top layer. So we always had 3 layers on our wagon to unload into the barn. And then once it was back in the barn, my brother and my father and myself would go back out for another load, and Mama and my older sister would go up in the haymow to spread it out. In the background, you can barely see the outline of the silo where we put silage in the wintertime. I do remember where we would have to get up there and chop out the silage around the edge because it would freeze sometimes as much as 2 feet in. And you didn't want a 6-foot wall of silage hanging above your head while you were in there moving the thawed stuff down, so you dump it down in the manger for spreading to feed the cattle. And this is a photo of the family as we're getting ready to move to Oregon in 1952. By this time, I had another brother, younger brother. He was the first one of the family born in the hospital. No particular reason that I know of, no threat to my mother's health, but just that by that time they decided that, okay, maybe the farmhouse isn't the best place for birthing babies. So in 1952, we left this in the winter and moved to this in the winter. And that is our house in Garden Valley. Garden Valley was a beautiful valley. We lived about 11 miles out from the city of Roseburg, which is about 180 miles straight south of Portland, Oregon. Coast Range to the west, foothills of the Cascade Mountains to the east, and it really was a garden spot. Those floods brought in lots of good soil for the topsoil, and the soil there really was about 6 feet of black loam, and so it really produced well. And here's an example. Beans were one of the crops raised out there, pole beans for harvesting to go to the canneries that were in Salem, Oregon. Pickers would be on the rows picking the beans of the right size and dump them into the bags, and we'd weigh the bags and take the bags, throw them onto the back of a truck, take them into town where they'd be weighed in bulk, and then some sacks would be selected for grading to decide how much your load of beans was worth, and then back onto the bigger trucks to go to Salem, Oregon. Another advance in technology. We went from using sacks to haul the beans to town to using these 4-foot by 4-foot by 4-foot boxes. Each box would hold about 1,000 pounds of beans, had a front-end loader on a tractor, and I learned the value of precision when loading those boxes because you had to have the 2x4s in the corners lined up exactly right, or the boxes wouldn't stack properly and they'd be topsy-turvy every which way. Every farmer runs the risk of something bad happening. I was walking on the outside of the bean field, and you can see the rows still standing there. The outer two or three rows were thick enough I could not see to know what had happened, but I knew immediately. I heard a whoosh, and I knew immediately what had happened. The patch had fallen down. One wire broke someplace, probably a weakness, maybe a little crimp in it or something. And once one went, the whole thing went. And we talked about that because we'd switched from Blue Lake beans to Kentucky Wonder beans, and we watched those vines grow, and they were much heavier, much thicker than what the Blue Lake were. And so we were concerned about it, and sure enough, it happened. And we tried to raise the vines, and we spent a few hours out there just trying to prop them up, restring the wires, and after a while, Dad said, "That's it. This ain't ever going to work." So we had a dedicated crew of pickers that came through, and they gleaned what they could off the vines on the ground, and the rest of it got disked into the soil. I was active in the Luther League at our church. This is our confirmation photo, significant because of the next one. Between my junior and senior year in high school, there was a group of, I think there's about 35 of us, that got onto the Empire Builder, the train that ran from Portland, Oregon to Chicago, Illinois. And we went to a Luther League convention at the Conrad Hilton on the shores of Lake Michigan. Big adventure for a kid who'd never been in anything more than a truck before to travel, other than a school bus to get back and forth to school. But that was a big adventure, a neat adventure. Two things memorable about the trip, neither one of which have anything to do with what we were there for in the convention. The first one was a couple of guys and I were walking along the shore of Lake Michigan, and all of a sudden this young black kid came tearing by running the other way. And we kind of looked and wondered what that's all about. A little further along, we found out what it was. A group of Hispanics had caught another young black kid and were threatening to throw him over the wall into Lake Michigan. And the kid is screaming, you know, I can't swim, don't do that, I can't swim. And myself and these other two guys are kind of looking at each other, okay, what do we do here? And fortunately, another older gentleman, and when I say older, he was probably in his mid to late 20s, and his girlfriend or wife were walking there as well. And he started talking to those Hispanics and said, look, you don't really want to do that, because if he can't swim, there's going to be a big issue later. And so they let him go, and the black kid took off running. That was my first exposure to any kind of discrimination. The town I grew up in, the high school I went to, had absolutely no minorities of any kind there. We were all white, some from the farms and some from the town, but that was it. The other thing that happened was myself, and again, one or two other guys were walking down the hall, and you know, hotels have these big conference rooms, and there's a guy sitting out front at a table, and he said, hey, you all ought to come in here. And so we did. And what it was a group of Serbians that were meeting, and what they were advocating for was a Serbian homeland. I didn't know where Serbia was, what it was all about. Found out later that it was a part of Yugoslavia at the time. And that was my first exposure to what I'm going to call international politics. And from then on, whenever I'd happened to see something referencing Serbia, I had some frame of reference for what it was all about. In high school, my sophomore year in high school, I was not in the a cappella choir, but the choir director saw me in the hall one time and walked up to me and said, hey, I'm thinking about starting a barbershop quartet. Would you be interested in singing the lead? Now, he probably got my name from my junior high music teacher because I sang in that choir there, and maybe I should call it a chorus. But anyway, I was in a couple of operettas as a 7th grader and 8th grader, and did a little singing and dancing. So I said, oh, well, I talked to my parents, and they said, sure, we'll support you and get you in and out to whatever you need to do in the evenings. And so my junior year, I also joined the a cappella choir, and we formed this little swing choir. And so I had a lot of activity in music with the performances and with the barbershop quartet. You know, we'd go down to the Kiwanis Club or other areas, things like that, and sing a few songs, and we'd get a meal or something out of it. And it was a lot of fun for a high school kid. One of the things that happened was going back to my freshman year. I was in a geography class, and my teacher was one of the football coaches. And one day he stopped after class. He said, why aren't you going out for the wrestling team? And I'd never thought about that before, but I thought, well, let's see. This coach is asking me to go out to the wrestling team, and he's got a reputation for boys that are on the athletic teams being pretty lenient with the grades. Geography class, lenient grades. Okay, here we go. So I went out for wrestling my freshman year and continued with that my sophomore year, and qualified for the state tournament my sophomore year, so did fairly well. And I was pretty happy with that, and the barbershop quartet's going on. Then my junior year in the swing choir a cappella, and one day I'm walking down the hall and the wrestling coach says, hey, getting ready to start practice again. You need to be ready to come out. And I went home and talked to my folks and said, well, wrestling is starting up again, and I'd kind of like to do that again. And they said to me, you're in a swing choir, you're in a barbershop quartet, you're in a cappella choir, and you're pretty well tied up with those things and practices and stuff after school. You got to make a choice, music or wrestling. And I looked around and said, sweaty high school boys on one hand, and you can see the ratio of girls to boys in this photo on the other hand. That was not a hard choice to make. I stuck with the singing. By 1962, I developed a lot of culture in class. I graduated from high school in 1958. 4 years later, I'd managed to finish 2 years of college because I'd laid out for a semester and go back and went to one full year from 59 to 60, and then had to lay out to earn money to go back, and then laid out another semester the next year and went back. So I'd finished 2 years by this time, and you can see where I was in my progression. On the other hand, Karen, 70 miles to my north, this is where she was. Didn't know her at the time, of course. She was in Springfield, Oregon. I'm down in Roseburg. But the summer of 62, she graduated in 1962, and she was the Lane County rodeo princess up there. She also grew up on a farm and had horses and had been doing a fair amount of riding, so very appropriate that she was selected for that. She happened to enroll in the same college I was going to periodically, Pacific Lutheran University in Parkland, Washington. And as I recall, it was sometime probably in November, early December. Two or three guys and I would wind up going to the cafeteria line early to be first in line, and we're sitting on the floor playing pinochle, and here she comes and gets in line behind us. And we had a little conversation, what are you doing, playing pinochle? And I'm looking at her thinking, why hadn't I seen you before on this campus? Because it wasn't a very big campus. I think it was only, I don't remember, 1,000 or 1,100 students at that time. Anyway, then I started seeing her in the hall as classes were changing, and I'd make eyes at her and kind of flirt. Finally worked up enough nerve to ask her to go for a cup of coffee, and that started the journey. 2 years later, 1964, 2 days after Christmas, we were married. I can't tell you what she saw in me as farm boy, and you can't see it in any of the photos you've seen, but by that time I'm missing one of my front teeth. I don't know what she saw in me, but I'm glad she saw something that she wanted to attach to. After graduating from college, I should back up and say that after we were married in 64, I was able to concentrate on going to school full time. I didn't have to work anymore. And she was working on her PhD, putting hubby through. And that's what she did. She was the breadwinner, and she bought the car, owned the car. I think I got my name on it eventually. But anyway, she was the breadwinner and put me through the rest of college. I graduated, got my degree in March of 66. I went to work for Weyerhaeuser for about 8 months. My first introduction to the technology of computers there. Weyerhaeuser, I worked in the accounting department. The first thing they did, I had previously worked out in the maintenance shop the previous summer, and they knew that, so they said, okay, we're automating this, and we're going to develop a punch card system, so you know something about the inventory out there, and so you go out there and work with those warehouse guys and figure out what they want to see on the cards and how they want them arranged, and then come back in and work with the programmers to get it developed. I did not do any of the programming. I was just kind of walking back and forth, talking to people and passing messages back and forth. And like I said, I also had a 2-week half day each day for 2 weeks that Weyerhaeuser had set up class taught by IBM. That was an introduction to computers, and at the end of it, they gave us a logic test. In December, I entered active duty in the Air Force, the draft being on my heels in the Vietnam era, and I didn't particularly want to join the Army. They said I could go fly helicopters. I didn't think I really wanted to do that, so I joined the Air Force, went to basic training, and during basic training, I had already applied for officer training school. I was selected to go to officer training school, and they also sent me to take a test called the electronic data processing test. And I'm very sure they did that because I had referenced that I'd taken an intro to computer course and also taken the IBM logic test. I scored well enough that when I received my commission in April of 1967, they assigned me to the data automation career field as opposed to accounting and finance. Turned out to be a real blessing. By October of 1968, I'm pinning on first lieutenant bars, nothing particularly noteworthy about that, except if you'll notice, Karen has a smock on, and she was 8 months pregnant with our oldest son at the time, who was born in November of '68 in the Navy hospital. Our first assignment, we moved from Oregon, where she had stayed while I was finishing officer training school, to none other than McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando. We shared the runway with the commercial airport at the time, and this was 1967, pre-Disney opening. So it's kind of a sleepy end of town at that point in time. And in the base housing, Karen had an early penchant for flowers, and I knew something about them from my days in Garden Valley. And they started a competition to award the winner of the week. And we won that the first week they offered it. Glad to see that. And these are the kinds of aircraft that we had. We had 2 squadrons of KC-135 tankers, refuelers, B-52 bomber squadron, and every now and again there'd be a U-2 that would fly in and out. And we get a chance to see that out on the runway. By 1970, I was looking for a change in career field, but the career monitors called me and said, hey, instead of switching on to data automation, would you go to Denver, Colorado and become part of the team that's developing the Joint Uniform Military Pay System, JUMPS. I had no idea what JUMPS was. I didn't know what the Air Force Accounting and Finance Center was, but I did know Denver, Colorado. And I thought, okay, well, that's all right. We can go there. I know where it is. I know it's in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and it should be a pretty good assignment. And it turns out it was a great assignment. I was on a team that developed the software for testing as we were working to transfer data from the base to the centralized computer system. And they were working to centralize all the Air Force pay records in Denver. And I got a chance to travel a little bit, including a trip to the Philippines in the summer of 1972. Great experience, except it happened to be a summer when they had some extreme flooding on the island of Luzon because it rained every day hard. And I think they had something like 60 or 70 inches of rain in that 1 month. Bad enough that the trailer I was staying in developed some leaks in the roof and water puddled on the floor, and I went to the base exchange and bought a drill and drilled holes in the floor to drain the water out. But other than that, it was a good experience. Lived with the geckos and whatnot in the trailer, but they kept the bugs down, so that was good. And while I'm off gallivanting, Karen she kept her beauty, and I'm glad for that. I'm also grateful that fashions have changed. We had a good time in Denver. I learned a lot on the technology side, how to communicate to overseas bases, why very slow records, how to design the software so that you could transmit records at the very slow rate and still get the data you needed. So that was a very good experience for me. In 1974, again, I wasn't particularly on a career track yet then, though I was doing quite well as far as the career field was concerned. But they called and offered me a job in the Pentagon, and I was actually assigned to Defense Communications Agency, and the initial job offer, the one I went there for, was to be in charge of one of the 4 officers running a large computer center. And they work 7 days on, 7 days off, 4 officers, 12-hour shifts. And I thought, oh, that's great. I can go there, work for a couple, 3 years there, get out, and then I'd be set up to get a job in the technology field somewhere for a company. Well, I get there and they say, no, we changed our minds. You're not going to do that. We've got another job for you. And they called it an automatic data processing liaison officer in the National Military Command Center. I didn't know what either one of them was, but after some consternation, I'm not sure how much they really knew I was grumbling, but I went up to started that job. Turned out to be a very interesting place, because this is where they kept track of things that were going on around the world, and when anything was happening, they prepared the briefings for the Secretary of Defense and the President. So the good thing was that there were times when it was really interesting and you were in the middle of stuff. The bad thing was the only time that really happened was when there was something bad going on around the world. But my job was to get the data out of the computer systems to give to the desk officers to tell them, okay, here's where our forces are, here's the status of the ships that are there, their readiness status, airplane status for the Air Force and the Navy. Here's what the unit readiness is for the military all the way around. And that was my job, was to get that information out of the computer. In 1974, in the fall, just after I'd gotten there to the National Military Command Center, I was selected to be on a test team, and I was still working in the NMCC, and that's where my little office was, around the corner from the main floor there, for testing the first 3 military bases brought up on what was ARPANET, ARPA-net, Advanced Research Project Agency. In the late 60s, ARPA had awarded a contract to Bolt, Beranek, and Newman to develop a technology for transferring information between computers remotely someplace else. And so they developed that, and initially it was 3 universities, then expanded to 6 universities, and then by 1972, there were 24 sites on it, still all universities and research sites, no military bases, and then in 74, they started the thing to say, okay, we think the technology's ready, let's test it out. And so I was on that test team, and I remember being in the room and sending messages back and forth to a site called Site R, the Rock, which is an underground bunker on the border of Pennsylvania and Maryland, which was an alternate National Military Command Center. And then the Pentagon, and then MacDill. And we're sending messages back and forth and just kind of chit-chat messages, nothing significant. And the folks in MacDill sent me a message and said, who's in the room with you? And I wrote back, it's Captain Arola, I'm here by myself. And they sent a message back to me saying, oh, we really got you outranked. We've got a couple colonels in here and some lieutenant colonels and 3 or 4 other folks here as well down in this room. And I shot a message back saying, you might have me outranked, but you'll never have me outmanned. And that drew a response immediately. He said, you can come work for me anytime. And I thought, MacDill, oh, that might be pretty good, except I just got to the Pentagon, so I knew I had another 3 or 4 years to go there. By 1978, the next opportunity for a move came up, and now it was career decision time, because I knew that I was on track for major promotion. I was coming up on that for that promotion board, and I knew that I was in good position to be promoted because of the jobs I had and the people I'd worked for and the reviews they wrote for me. And so they offered me a job in Germany, Ramstein Air Base. And so Karen and I talked about it and said, okay, yep, Germany, that should be a fun assignment. Let's go, first overseas assignment. So off we went. This is the house we lived in for the 3 years we were in Germany. Sulzbachtal, about 10 miles from Ramstein Air Base. Beautiful little village, about 700 people lived there. Maybe 3 other American families there, which we didn't see very often. Behind us was an apple orchard. Next door neighbors owned that. Just a wonderful place for our 2 boys to grow up. I think when we moved there, they were like in the 2nd and 4th grades. They'd go down to the farmer to get the milk in the evening with their 1-liter jug. Our oldest son was there when pigs were being born and calves were being born, and the farmer would take the boys out and on his tractor sometimes out to the field. Just a great place to grow up. They did ride the bus to school. This big luxury Mercedes tour bus would pull up in front, and they'd get on it, and off to school they'd go at the DoD school in Kaiserslautern. And this was our technology for travel while we were in Germany. 1974 Volkswagen camper, that 4-cylinder air-cooled engine, only had to replace it once in the 3 years that we were there. Not much power to it, and when we were going up the hills on the Autobahn, we stayed in the right lane with the trucks because we ain't going very fast. But it was a great way for us to travel. We were still young enough to put up with the sleeping accommodations. And one time, my sister-in-law and her 2 kids came up from Cyprus to visit us in Germany, and all 7 of us piled in that thing, threw a tent in there as well, and we went off to Paris. And got there, and in my normal planning skills, I hadn't really thought about where we were staying. We're driving around trying to figure out, okay, where can we set up for the night? And we see this park where, there's a bunch of people setting up tents and stuff. So we pull in there and set up, put the kids in the tent, and my sister-in-law and Karen and I slept in the camper. And at 6 in the morning, wham, 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 somebody's banging on the side of the camper and waking us up, and it's a police eye. Wait, France, Paris, Gendarme, whatever it is. The police was waking us up. Turns out we were in a park. It was okay to sleep there at night, but you had to get out of there during the day. So we went and found a campground that was legitimate, and we could stay there. That VW got us all over Europe, including the Swiss Alps, to Austria, France, Beaune wine country in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and even down to Spain. Karen's parents came to visit us, and while we were traveling around Germany, we came to this little community called Mittenwald. Well, Mitten was Karen's maiden name, so of course we had to stop and take advantage of the photo op. And of course you can't be in Germany without wine, and that's Karen's parents on the left in front of the Volkswagen. On the right are our next door neighbors, the man and his wife, and the girl sitting on the stone wall there was our kid's babysitter at the time. We became very good friends. He was the local hunting master, Jägermeister. He took me hunting up on a deer stand with him one time. We didn't get anything, but I mean, it was just interesting that he would take me along on a trip like that. And they were such good friends, in fact, that when we were moving out in 1981 and our household goods were being packed up for shipping, we stayed with them for a couple days. And years later, when I was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, they all came to visit us. I mean, we've stayed in touch with Birgit. Both her parents have since died, but we stayed in touch with Birgit, and as a matter of fact, we've communicated with her just in the last couple days. Every now and again, a photo comes up that we see that we send to her, and this photo came up, so we sent it to her. And we wound up in Spain one time, and you can see, if you'll pay attention to Karen's right ankle down there, I'll let her explain to you sometime what actually happened. But she actually, worse than a little sprain, it really turned out to be a hairline fracture. So she couldn't do a lot of what she wanted to do, but still, it was nice to be on the beach in Benidorm. While in Germany, I had one day, my first job there was working with NATO on developing interoperability between the Air Force and the U.S. military software and hardware systems and the NATO hardware and software systems to make sure we could exchange information. I came back from a trip about a year after I'd been into that job, came back from a trip to the Pentagon doing some coordination work. And I was the first one in the office almost every day because I got in about 6:30 and I was making the coffee and my boss walked in. He never got there that early in the morning. And he looked at me and said, "Don't bother going back to your desk. You've got a new job." He said, "You're the new executive officer." I thought, dang, what's this all about? I literally never went back to my desk. I had my coffee cup in my hand. I went in up to the front office and sat down at the executive officer's desk. And then my former boss brought in my personal effects from my desk. And after that, I didn't do anything to turn it over. My new boss up in the office there said, "Nope, you can't have him anymore. I've got him. He's not working down there. You guys figure it out." And they did. But it turned out, again, to be one of those things where you first think, what in the world is this? Do I really want to do this? And turns out to be a really good career break for me. Learned all kinds of things about front office operations. There was some conflicts between the head guy and his deputy wound up not getting the head job when the first guy left because of that conflict. New guy comes in, and I don't know how to make this sound like I'm not bragging too much, but he really relied on me to get up to speed on what was going on in the unit and how to handle things with the other officers. And it really, again, it's one of those things where he did a very good job for me in setting me up for the next promotion. I have this picture up here because when I was up there as an executive officer, some of the enlisted guys would come through, and a couple of the young troops, talked about, these personal computer things are starting up. So we'd talk about that, and in 1979, I ordered my first personal computer, an Apple II. And one of the enlisted guys ordered a TRS-80. And we'd have some arguments back and forth between which was better, my Fruit Squared or his Trash 80. Anyway, ever since that time, I've kept up with the PC world and had PCs around. Didn't really do much with this first one other than play Pong. But I did do a little programming on it just to kind of figure out what is this all about. In 1981, when I finished my tour in Germany, I was selected to go to Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, which is Air Command and Staff College is the Air Force's equivalent of a master's program. And there wasn't too much that I thought was noteworthy about it. I really enjoyed studying some of the military history and listening to some of the speakers that we had. But this here I thought was a really significant event. 1982 was the first time that they created a painting called Great Moments in Aviation History. And they've done it, I think, every year since then. But this was the first one. They commissioned an artist, and he did the research and with the Air Command and Staff guys and figured out, okay, which planes do we want? Who are the pilots that are still alive? And those signatures you see at the bottom are the original signatures of 15, I think there's 15 of them. All 15 of them signed every print, 1,100 prints total, all the way from flyers from the First World War, Lee Wade and George Vaughan, all the way up to Neil Armstrong in the space capsule. And our graduation ceremony, every one of those pilots except Neil Armstrong attended. Bob Hope was the MC, and that was really a memorable time for me. And during my Air Command and Staff days there, they called up and asked me if I was interested in being an exchange officer with the Royal Air Force. So I accepted the job as an exchange officer with the Royal Air Force in RAF Innsworth, which is about 100 miles almost straight west from London. great opportunity. By now, we'd upgraded our camping technology to a 1982 Volkswagen camper with a diesel engine, still severely underpowered. And this is a picture of us at Blackpool. But it had a refrigerator that ran on either electricity you could plug in, or it ran off gas. We had a little propane tank, and we had a little two-burner stove up there. So this was really luxury camping. And of course, working with the RAF, one of the things they expected was on the 4th of July, we would host a party, and so we did. Got a chance to go to the Queen's birthday parade in 1983. Photo with the Buckingham Guard there, and then the troops before they were trooping the color before the Queen. After my assignment there, I was selected to go to Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska. My original job was, what they told me, was I was going to be a commander of the Information Systems Squadron. I get there, and again, things changed, and they said, nope, that squadron doesn't exist anymore. We put together the communications folks with the computer folks, and now it's all one organization. The position's not there, so I got a staff job instead. And then a year later, they said, well, we need to split out the base level folks. And I volunteered to take the commander's position. Again, that's one of those fortuitous God moments, because that job turned out to set me up for the next promotion. But more than that, was just a tremendous opportunity of learning and growing. I had 480 people at Elmendorf in my squadron, 2 remote detachments, one at Galena Air Base, Galena, Alaska, and one in King Salmon. 60 people at Galena, 30 at King Salmon. 13 work centers that worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, doing everything from telephones for the base to satellite communications, networks, just everything. Just wonderful job. And on Christmas Eve, the tradition was we prepared cookies for each of the work centers that had to work Christmas Eve, and we deliver them to the work center. And they really appreciated that. One of the things I learned early on in the commander's position was that there's no substitute for getting out and visiting people in the workplace. And so I started doing that religiously. And after about a year, I knew the names of every person in the squadron, all 480 of them, where they worked, what they did. Just a great, great assignment. And one of the things I got to do, one of the enlisted persons in the squadron was getting married. Her father could not make it up for the wedding. She asked me to escort her down the aisle. And to me, that was a real honor to be asked to do that. Vice President Bush stopped at Elmendorf. Nothing particularly noteworthy there, except being in the communications business. We got to work with his staff on setting up all the communications and worrying about the satellite communications and all that stuff, keeping him connected where he needed to be connected. Part of my job, air traffic control, and I got a chance to go out to USS Enterprise in 1987 to watch aircraft operations from the flight deck of the Enterprise. A real eye-opener for what those Navy folks do. I mean, I just marveled at the precision and what those guys on the flight deck had to do to get the planes in the air and get them back down on the deck. I also got a chance to fly in a T-33 trainer. I wanted to go in an F-15, but they didn't want me to do that. Turns out it's probably a good decision, because this was plenty for me when the pilot put it through its rolls and all that kind of stuff. He even gave me the stick for a while. It was fun, but I learned that, man, I didn't have the stomach to do too much of that. I tried to figure out how I could switch the labels on these photos, but I figured with Karen holding her fish, it would be pretty obvious. Can't be in Alaska without fishing, and obviously hers is much bigger and better than mine. Snakes in Alaska? Oh yes. Our oldest son was sophomore in high school in his biology class, and the teacher there had a couple of snakes. And every summer he'd go off commercial fishing, and so he'd look for a student to take care of him for the summer. And of course, our son, being who he was, jumped up, yes, I'll do that. Well, that turns out to be the summer they shut the school down at the end of March and didn't open it again until the 1st of October. So they were removing all the asbestos from the school. So instead of 3 months, we had those suckers in our house for 6 months. And they're a real kid attractor. I'll tell you, you take them outside and let them crawl around on the grass, you get a bunch of kids around in a hurry. Takedown was the boa constrictor. Monty Python, of course, was the python. Python's there on the toilet. Not sure what he was doing out and loose, but he did not come up through the toilet. He was actually in a cage normally. I'm going to switch gears now. After I retired from the Air Force, I did go to work for GRU for 12 years as the Information Systems Director. Again, it was just a great job. I enjoyed it a lot, learned a lot more there about things. Was there, as a matter of fact, for the birth of OCAMIC, and one of the guys, the technical guys, Frank Latini, came into the office one day and said, hey, we need to get into OCAMIC. With our fiber optic network that was being developed and installed around town. And so I wasn't in charge of that project by any stretch, but was a part of the development of GRUNet from the technical side. And so I knew about that early on, and here we are later taking advantage of that technology. Now I'm going to switch gears and just wanted to encourage people that when you have an opportunity to participate in some of the tests that go on here, the studies that go on here, do that. This is one of the studies on gaits and how gaits change as you age and all that stuff, and they wire you up and put all these sensors on you, and you get on a treadmill and they record you as you're walking. And that was just interesting to do that. And there are a number of studies around here where you get a chance to participate, and I would encourage you to investigate them and go for those that you might be interested in. I'm going to turn now and take a look at the beauty of God's creation here at OCAMIC. You know, we tend to not notice a lot of things around, and to take a play on Yogi Berra, you can see a lot by looking. Summer tanager, flowers in the backyard. And I'm just going to flip through these quickly. Morning dove with the Easter lilies and the, forget the name of the one in the background, but they're common around here. I had to blow this up pretty significantly to make sure all 3 birds showed up, but interesting, 3 species sharing a bath. One morning, and we have that bird bath outside our bedroom window. I took the screen off the window so that I could set up my iPhone against the window, and without the screen being between me and just means I have to keep the window clean, but that's okay. Walking by the pond one day, and you got a great egret. One of the things I try to remind myself when I'm walking down the sidewalk is keep your head up, George. Don't be looking down all the time. But if you do that all the time, then you miss stuff like this. Walking by the pond one time, taking a cut through there. It's not on the sidewalk, but here's this regal moth caterpillar going across there. That one was about 3 inches long. This one, fortunately, was only 1.5 inches long. I have no idea what it is. I just thought, golly, that's kind of threatening looking, except it's pretty small. And this one you can barely see. I mean, it almost blended into the sidewalk. It was kind of transparent. Have no idea what it is. Nymph of some kind, I'm sure. Molting, getting ready to molt, do something different. But again, one of those interesting things you see when you look around. Cicada, I didn't know they had that color to them until I got a close-up of it. Yeah, it's the same butterfly. This is down at the garden area, and the flowers down there, and I see this butterfly flying around. I thought I saw a flash of blue there. What is that all about? And so I videoed it, and these are screenshots I got off that video. Yeah, it's the same butterfly. It's all part of that same video. Black swallowtail. Again, I'm walking down to the garden area, and here's this bunch of Spanish moss that had fallen out of the tree. And there's a black swallowtail. I have no idea what it was getting off that Spanish moss, but it was busy moving from spot to spot. Again, these are screenshots from a video that I took. Fraz on bees. I don't know how many of you know Fraz on bees or know the comic strip Fraz. Kind of a takeoff on Beans, Beans, the musical fruit. You might remember that from a few years ago. Bees, bees are magical things. They're more than honey, more than stings. They pollinate the plant supply. No plants, no food, we die. They're crucial to the commonweal, so let's thank bees for every meal. And now some photos of the bees. Red and black mason wasp. We have these bee boxes down at the garden area that you can go by and take a look at the activity there. Green mason bee. Just incredible when you look at the details of those things. Thread-waisted wasp. You have to kind of look at this one for a little while to see how skinny that waist is, how big the body is up front, and then the tail down there, how long it is. And that was, again, down at the garden area. Four-toothed mason wasp. Wrens in our garage. First, I was kind of resentful that we had to leave the door cracked open for them all the time, but then it's really great to have them grow up there and watch them grow and mature. Wanted to use a hose bib by one of our garden plots down there, and this one's sitting there threatening me, saying, "Get away. We don't need you here." Actually, it's probably threatening some other critter, but I took it as a threat to me to stay away. And this one was in our backyard, arguing about whose it is. She won. Or he, I'm not sure. I blame it. I call her a she. This next part is just reflections. It's incredible what you see sometimes when you walk around. And this is the sinkhole when it was relatively filled. That is the big house here in the background. Not often you see the water that still and are able to get those kind of photos, but I happened to be there at the right time. Again, incredible beauty in our creation. And I'll finish with this one. Well, not quite done yet. I'll let you figure out. One of them's upside down. Let you look at it for a minute and see if you can figure out which one's pretty obvious. That white pipe you see in the middle of the pond on the left, that's where it should be. It doesn't belong in the trees up there on the right. And Karen wasn't sure I should show this last photo, but I figured with this audience and this crowd and the maturity level that it would be okay. Working on the next generation. On the left, a couple of golf fritillaries doing what they need to do to keep butterflies flying, and the red and black mason wasp on the right. The one on the right took me about 9 minutes of video before I finally got that shot. I was trying to figure out, the one was inside, and I keep seeing the antenna come out, and a couple times the legs would come out, and I thought maybe it was hatching and trying to crawl out. Well, I don't think it was hatching. I think it was a female in there laying eggs, and she came out, and that was the result. That ends my presentation. Are there any questions?